Hi there, welcome to my video. Today I'm going to show you how to make a landscape textile collage using an old photograph of Alnwick Castle. Before I get started, thank you first of all for purchasing one of my kits and coming along to see the video. This short tutorial is just to help you sort of get the bones of the piece together. It sits alongside the instructions that are in your kit, but it can be useful to kind of just have a little listen along. You can pause it, rewind it, fast forward it at certain points, so you can sort of use it how you see fit. But it's supposed to be a sort of a helpful guide showing you how I put these things together, just how I approach them, and just guide you through some of the stitches that you could use. And the idea with these kits is that you don't have to produce a carbon copy of the piece I've made, but you're encouraged to sort of take on board some of the points that I say and try and create your own. So before I get started, I just thought I'd mention the inspiration behind this little kit. It came from this found postcard which I got at a local flea market, and it's of Alnwick Castle, and it's a sent postcard. It's got a little lovely message and address on the back, which is just as beautiful as the front, but I think I can just about make out the date stamp, and I think it's about August 1916, which is just quite a find. And because I like to keep the originals and be able to work and stitch with these things, I print them onto inkjet cotton, which I'll go through in just a moment when I'm talking about how to put the collage together. But yeah, I just thought you might like to see the initial inspiration. So it goes from sort of postcard to printed cotton. And I'll come back to my finished piece as I go through the video as I'm talking more about hand embroidery. But for now, let's get started. Okay, so in your kit you have a few materials. You'll only need to add things like pins, needles, scissors. It's handy to have an iron and an ironing board nearby as well. I'm actually working on my ironing board today. That's why you can see the odd little bond web marks here and there. I'm dreadful at keeping my iron for clothes only. It always ends up being used for arty things. So in your kit you'll find a piece of curtain bump, which is a lovely sort of woolen backing. Very similar to felt, just makes everything a little bit more substantial when you put that behind your work, and that's our first step. We're going to lay the bump down and put our white linen base over the top, which is also in your kit. You'll also have a piece of bond web, which is paperback glue. You'll have your printed image, some fabrics for collage, some white machine thread, all will be explained in a bit, some buttons and some hand embroidery threads as well. So you've got your linen placed over your bump, that's going to be the background. The next thing we need to do is work with the photograph. Now this is printed onto cotton, so it does have a paper backing on it. I really like this brand of printed cotton that I use, or printable cotton should I say, sorry. You can just send it through an inkjet printer. So if you are interested in the link for it, please do email me, because I've used a lot of different brands over the years. And I find this one's really good because the image is sharp and crisp. It doesn't rub off as you sew. You'll feel a little bit of resistance when you stitch through this material once it's on your base fabric, but it is completely stitchable. It's just got a few treatments on the surface, which is why it's a little bit harder to get a needle through, but it's still workable. The first thing you need to do, you'll notice, is it comes on a paper backing. You just need to peel that backing off. You can just discard that now. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take a piece of bond web, and you can see if I bring this to the camera, it's got a slightly shiny side, that's your glue side, and it's got a paper side. What you need to do on the back of your printed photo fabric is you need to put the shiny side onto the back of your fabric, and then you're going to iron that onto the back of your photograph. So I'm just going to press it in place by ironing it for a few seconds with a hot dry iron, and then it's ready to use. Okay, so that's in place. Don't peel the paper backing off just yet. You might want to try trimming the photograph down first. It's a lot easier to trim when the paper backing is on the photograph. You get a nice clean cut that way. So you could just use the photograph as it is. You might need to trim something down if it's slightly bigger than the piece of fabric that you've got, but I should have cut them all to size. What you could do if you wanted to, which I've done in my sample here, which I'll show you, is I've actually, while the bondweb paper is on the back, I've cut away the skyline. So you could do that as well. So you could just go along the skyline and trim that edge away. Okay, so you can see I've cut away the skyline now, so I've got quite a nice edge there. And because I still have the paper on the back, it was really easy to cut. The fabric was nice and sturdy. So if I want to glue that in place now, I can simply peel off the paper backing and iron in place. But before I do that, I'm just going to mention that this postcard in particular has got a nice little title down there. What I'm going to do, because I quite like to title my pieces, is I'm just going to chop off that little piece that says Alnwick Castle, because I might use that later on to title the collage. So I'm just going to snip that off. It doesn't matter if it's a bit messy to start off with, because you can neaten it up later on. The important thing is you keep it to one side somewhere safe. So you've just got that little snippet of fabric there. You can see in my sample, Alnwick Castle comes in here just at the bottom, and it almost acts like a title for the whole piece. So if you've got those little details on old postcards, it's sometimes quite nice to keep them. So don't worry about this little gap now, because we're going to cover that with Textile Collage, which is the next stage. But now that we've got this all cut, you can just very gently work at a corner and peel away the Bondaweb paper backing. And what you'll find is, you can hear that noise, that means it's stuck. Discard the paper. And now you've got the glue. If you can just sort of just see that little texture on the back of your printed paper, printed cotton. You've got the glue on the back of your cotton. So that's backed with glue now. So what you can do is you can place that just towards the top of your piece of fabric, because we're going to collage down from the river. And then you can iron it in place. Again, just sort of 5 seconds or so with a hot dry iron. I sometimes keep the steam on, it's fine, it doesn't make a difference. If you've got scorch marks on the bottom of your iron, it might be worth covering it with a tea towel just to make sure you don't get any marks on your work. And then that is ironed in place. So now I can work with that, and that is pretty much secured. Okay. Okay, so once we're at that stage, getting the photograph onto the backing fabric, the next bit's the fun bit. Now you can start to collage your fabrics down to create a textured landscape. So these really are very imagined landscapes. They're sort of a really abstract representation of what a landscape would be. But looking at the photograph, you can see we've got fields and riverbanks. We've actually got the river that passes by Alnwick Castle. And then the suggestion of more grassy fields and hillocks and wildflowers and sort of scrub area on the other side of the riverbank. So you can start snipping now and placing, and this is the nice bit really, because you just get to kind of layer and faff about and explore and pick up little bits of fabric and, you know, sort of make decisions here and there. You might want to add some fabrics from your own stash into this if you've got some fabrics that have got really interesting textures that you think might work really nicely for something like riverbeds or sort of grassy knolls. I'm just slicing a few bits here to describe the river, which kind of slashes across on a very gentle angle at the bottom of that postcard. And you can see as well when I cut, I'm not cutting straight lines. I'm not trying to cut something in a really deliberate shape. I really kind of just use the back of my scissors almost, and I make little snipping motions and just kind of pull through the fabric, and it creates a bit of a serrated edge. It's almost like if you imagine you were doing a tissue paper collage, and you want that sort of torn edge, and then once you've got these little slices of colour, then you can start sort of bringing them in from the edge. So leave some of the photographs shown by all means, but obviously I've cut that little bit out there for the Alnwick Castle later on, so I'm going to make sure that gets covered up. But where there's darker areas, perhaps put some darker greys in, and just let it build up nice and slowly, a bit at a time. Just enjoy that kind of faffing, really, there's no better word for it. And you can lay this all the way out, and you can pin as you go, or you can lay everything out and pin afterwards. But once you're happy with your collage, do pop some pins in place. And I'm just going to continue with this one now, so we can move on to then chat about the next step. So it can just be almost like slices coming in from the edge of the page, and you start to build that collage up, and that gives you that gentle sense of bands of colour in the landscape, and again that sort of perspective. And don't worry if it looks messy at this point. This looked messy at this point. When you get all of the stitching into it and you iron it, then it really sort of comes alive. So once you've decided where all the collage pieces go, you can pin them in place. You'll see that I've worked from sort of the top to the bottom, laying each new piece in front of the last piece, and that just helps to create a little sense of perspective in your collage. You can pin in place. There's lots of tiny pieces to work with, so if you find that things look like they're going to start moving as you're ready to start pinning, then it's sometimes a good idea to take a photograph of your work on your phone, and you can work from that. So if things start moving around, you've got something, you've got like a reference point to know where everything belongs and put them back in place. I have heard tell as well that if you don't want to use loads of pins, a Pritt stick or a glue stick is a really good way of like a pin substitute. So if you don't want to put loads of pins in your work, you can take each piece off and just put a little bit of Pritt stick down and glue them in place, and that will hold it for the time being until you're ready to do embroidery. But I haven't tested that myself. It's just one of those top tips that someone else told me, which is on my list of things to try. So working with this many pins in a piece is a bit of a nightmare when it comes to embroidery, because your embroidery threads will inevitably end up wrapped around all the pins. So in your kit you've got a little piece of just white poly cotton thread. There's a few meters on there, and that's just to do a tack and stitch, and I call it a stab stitch, just to get everything in place so we can get rid of these pins and get ready for some embroidery. So you need to take your needle and thread with the white machine thread. It's too fine to be knotted, so I just sew it into the back of the bump. This is where the bump's really good because it is quite thick, so it's quite substantial when you start knotting things into it. So just sew it in so it's a little knot, you can tug it and that thread doesn't come out. Push it through at the front, and then you're just going to do small stitches. So you're just going to go into the fabric close to where you came out, and you're just going to make a tiny pinprick of a stitch, and it's just enough to catch in those bits of fabric but to not be able to see the thread that you're sewing with. And I often just start from the top and work from right to left down in a zigzag and just catching all the pieces as I go. So I'll just do a couple of pieces here to show you. And I sort of stitch about an inch or two apart. It doesn't have to be really exact. It's not going to be seen. You know, it sort of disappears into the fabrics, and then once you've got your hand embroidery on top as well, you really can't see it. And if you've got any bits that are sort of wiggling about, you can just anchor them in place with the odd stab stitch as well. And as you go along, you can get rid of the pins, and that's the nice bit. You can take the pins out, and then you can really start to see your work. So stab stitch all of the collage pieces so that when your pins are out, nothing falls off. And then if you give it a quick press with the iron, then you'll be ready for some hand embroidery. So one of the last stages really is hand embroidery, and in your kit you've got 6 different colours of 6-stranded embroidery cotton. Now I would never, they're in sort of metre and a half lengths roughly, but I would always cut a smaller piece of thread to work with, because anything that's longer from your sort of hand to your elbow is just likely to get into knots. I won't be chatting through every embroidery stitch. I'm just going to sort of give an overview of the different stitches I've used and the effects that they gave on the collage. And there are stitch guides in the instructions in the kits themselves as well. And sometimes I just stick with the most simple stitches. I tend to find that the most simple stitches often give the best effect. Just imagine you're using stitch as if you're using a drawing line. But to go back to this thread that you've got on your kits, it's 6-stranded cotton, and it's good to split it. So I usually use 1 or 2 strands when I'm working on this sort of scale. The temptation when you split these is to take them and pull them apart. That can often mean that they twist and knot. So a little trick is to splay the 6 strands in your hand there. If I can try and hold that over the white card, you may be able to see a bit easier. And then just take 1 strand at a time and pull them straight up and straight out. And that way you can split your threads and you don't end up in knots. So if I was to pull a second one out, it just stays nice and unknotted, which is really handy. And then you can just lay out the amount of threads that you want. So I would lay 2 out there, snip the top so they're both the same length, and then I would be ready to start sewing with a couple of strands of the blue, for instance. But there are, as I say, there are 6 colours in your pack, and so using those colours is quite interesting on the landscape. So I've used lighter colours for these haystacks. So in some cases you can actually work into the printed image as well. As I say, you'll feel a little bit more resistance when you stitch into that, but it is totally sewable. It's just because of the treatments that are on the fabric for it to retain that printed image. I've got lots of seed stitch there just to describe random sort of placings of leaves on trees. There's a little bit of back stitch. Again, this back stitch here just to describe some of the movement in the river. Again, running stitch here. Some of the really most simple stitches ever can, once built up, can create a really nice effect. So there's lots of running stitch. There's just some little stitches that are sort of sewn in a line, but they're all vertical. I do use lots of knots, but I tend to do my knots last. So I tend to go through all of the layers first of all and just do, you know, the running stitches, the back stitches, little seed stitches scattered all over. So everything's kind of battered down. You can see that I've used sort of tone on tone. and sometimes I might use a lighter colour on a darker fabric. The last thing I do is to go back into things with texture, and that's where I bring French knots in. And sometimes I do French knots really tight, and that's a good indicator for little flower heads, good little suggestion for wildflowers. Sometimes I keep them really loose, and then you get those lovely textures there which could suggest sort of grassy knolls, little bits of rocks or boulders that are poking out of the grass as well. And you can see at the bottom here I've got the Alnwick Castle sign, which I chopped off at the beginning of the tutorial, so that's already got the bond web on the back, so that can just be ironed in place. And I often, and it's sort of I guess like a bit of a signature style in my landscape pieces, put these longer cow parsleys or longer wildflowers at the front, or at the very bottom, sorry. I keep saying front because I'm thinking of perspective, but it's at the bottom of the piece. And I say front because it gives the idea of perspective. So you've got bigger flowers at the front, you've got a small castle at the back, and that just helps in an abstract way suggest distance and suggest landscape. And again, just one last little thing there, there's some little fly stitches to suggest some grass. You can also use some of the darker colours or the flower colours that are included in the kit to just create a little bit of interest in the skyline. So I added some little flags on the top of my castle and some birds in the sky. And lastly, the thing to think about, I suppose, is framing it. I like to see the raw edges on my work, so sometimes I don't always have a straight edge. This one is fairly neat, but if you've got bits that hang over the sides, sometimes that can add extra texture and interest. Equally, you might want to pop a mount over it so it looks really neat within a mount. Both ways look really nice, but the main thing is that you have the chance to create a collage that appeals to you and you've enjoyed making, and that you can sew into and add texture to and really raise the surface. So I hope you found this useful. Please do get in touch if you've got any questions, or if you'd like to share your finished piece, because I do always like to see what's been made from the kits. And I hope you have a happy summer of sewing.